Take two. We are going to resume with meeting number 57 of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, as was agreed to earlier today. And we are currently on MP Turnbull's amendment. And I'm going to pass the floor to Mr. Fergus, who's first on my list, followed by Mr. Turnbull, then Mrs. Sahota, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to reopen our discussion this afternoon. Madam Chair, I must express my profound disappointment given the way that our meeting, our earlier session, ended 3 hours and 20 minutes ago with the comments made by Mr. Cooper. They really were not at the level of Parliament, and I would offer, if he wants to interrupt me with a point of order, to apologize, not only to Minister Joly for his comments that lacked restraint, but I think that he could have already have apologized, but I have to say it's been 3 hours, 20-some minutes now, and I have not detected any type of apology forthcoming. But let's get back to what we have at hand. We were speaking to the amendment to the motion that was moved by my colleague, Mr. Turnbull. And, you know, Madam Chair, one of the reasons why it's so important to concentrate with individuals who are part of a working group, a task force on threats that occurred to our elections. In English, it's called a SITE. Well, that was an important group because it invited participants to participate. I have to say that it was an institution that was developed and that was very important to to provide the opportunity to combat foreign interference. And also, it was something that was being offered and that is still being offered for all political parties that are recognized in the House of Commons. They can take part in that. They can become members. And all parties, including the Bloc Québécois, have taken advantage of that offer. They, in fact, participated. Not only did they hear information that was secret with respect to foreign interference, but they also had the opportunity to speak with experts and the membership of this working group, of this task force, to ask questions and to express their concerns, to be able to identify, to have the opportunity of identifying the signals that they themselves had heard or things that their candidates had heard, and then to compare that with the information that our national security experts were sharing with that group. That is very important. It's something that is very useful. That is part, really, of a long action plan that has been undertaken by our government after the 2015 election. And why did it do so? Because it was quite clear, well before that time, that there were state and non-state actors who were trying to influence our elections, who sought to interfere with our election and our democratic institutions. And it's just too bad that the Ontario government did not act to reassure Canadians, previous governments, to protect Canadians on that matter. Even the former Minister for Democratic Institutions of the Harper government, and not the Ontario government, offered an explanation this week that the reason why he did not act was because the so-called government, the Chinese government, wasn't on the side of their party, and so it really wasn't in their interest, to act in any way. Well, really, that's ridiculous. Madam Chair, not only was that group, that task force created to look into the election and the possibility of interference, but there was also a national group that was created because all our allies are allies in the security, national security and intelligence groupings involving New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, as well as Canada. We were the only ones that didn't have a similar group to look at and examine our security and intelligence services, and also to receive information from that particular group. So, at the very beginning of our government, we set up this group, this committee, and it is a very useful committee. I have not had the privilege of being part of that committee, but some members here around the table have, in fact, had that privilege in previous parliaments. And without any sharing of information or disclosure of any sort, they have certainly had very interesting experiences, to say the very least. I'm sure there were many things that were dealt with, and Canada faces threats. The government has had to act. Because of that, we also created a public protocol in 2018 to deal with major election incidents, and also an initiative was undertaken to have a rapid response mechanism, as a G7 rapid response mechanism, and the task force on the group dealing with possible interference in elections was created. This was all done to combat foreign political influence. And Bill C-59 that dealt with issues of national security was important as well. Also, C-76 was a bill that dealt with the modernization of the electoral system of elections. I can say, to top it all off, that the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity was also created by the government. And given all these institutions, all these tools, Madam Chair, were intended and are intended to protect Canadians, to ensure that we are free and that we can fight against foreign interference. That is so very, very, very important. And that is the reason why my colleague, Mr. Turnbull's amendment is so important. We will have the opportunity, really, of ensuring that we'll be able to hear the testimony of people who will know what happened during the 2019 and the 2021 elections. When people come here, they will not have the opportunity to share secret information, of course. But insofar as possible, they will share with us, as was the case last week, our witnesses last week before the committee, last Wednesday and Thursday. We had some excellent representatives of the CSE. We heard people from the RCMP. We had as witnesses deputy ministers from GAC and Global Affairs Canada, of course, and people who were responsible for public safety. And we also had the senior advisor for foreign policy for the Prime Minister, Madame Thomas, who appeared as well. There were questions, and the experts, Madam Chair, the people who are devoted and whose only goal is to protect us. And in fact, they do so by all means possible. Well, what was their conclusion? They said, yes, we recognize that there were leaks in the newspapers, but those leaks are not intelligence. They do not represent a complete picture of the situation. They were very careful to explain to us, Madam Chair, that there can be incidents that are brought up with them, but that one incident does not make the truth. They said, first of all, you have to see that in a context. And I remember last week I quoted something that is, text without context is only a pretext. So Madam Chair, that means that you have to have a bigger picture, an overall view of something. What they said and the conclusions, I'm putting that in parentheses, the so-called conclusions that certain journalists are using and publishing do not provide an overall global view that would allow us to see whether it is legitimate or not. I'm sure that my colleagues are thinking, Greg, you don't want to have the opportunity to explore that information, to develop an overall comprehensive view? There are two, perhaps three weaknesses, or shall I say three problems with these intentions. The first being to have a comprehensive overall view, you have to rely on the national security intelligence that, through its very nature, we cannot discuss in public. And secondly, I don't have that security clearance. And I think that most people around the table here don't have it either. But I do have good news. There is a place where there are members who do have that security clearance. And those are the people who are members of the NSICOP, the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. They are the ones who have the necessary security clearance. They are our peers, our counterparts. Those people have that possibility. So why not entrust them with the study so that they can have all of the information, all of the intelligence? And people might say, well, it's not public. How can Canadians trust their work? But that presumes then that the NSICOP does not publish its reports. But that is false. They do so. They do so regularly. I've had the opportunity of reading one of their reports. I have not read all of it or all of the reports, but I have finished one of the reports, Madam Chair, and I learned things. It gave me a picture of, well, a picture that was quite complete, a picture that allowed me to draw conclusions. At a certain point in time, people, we as members of Parliament, have to trust our colleagues who sit on that committee. They deserve our trust. They are people who've gone through a very, very stringent assessment. Some of those people certainly deserve to have the highest possible security clearance. I trust them. And that is the place for that discussion to be held. Now, the second thing is this, Madam Chair. I have said, and perhaps my colleagues might ask questions of me about it, and in fact, why not? Since we're all here at PROC around the table, hey, well, the first answer might be, why are we at PROC and not there? Well, it's because you don't have the security clearance, perhaps. But, Madam Chair, I say with great sadness that for Canadians who are listening to the committee, to this committee, or to question period, I don't think that they have seen the best of ourselves, the best of us. They see that we can be too partisan. We ask questions sometimes for which we really don't want an answer. We ask a question and the person who should answer doesn't have the time to. Or when there is an answer to the question, people don't accept that answer. They start talking about something else. And that's really too bad. It is too bad, because I think we're quite capable of doing better. It's possible. But now, at this point, I am not convinced. Another parenthesis, if you allow me, Madam Chair. Yesterday evening, I don't know how to say that in French, my goddaughter visited me with her brother and her parents. I took them to the House of Commons after the House rose last night, and we were talking. A young person, 14 years old, started talking about question period, yesterday's question period. Those two young people were not impressed by the attitude that was demonstrated by certain members of Parliament. It wasn't at the level of the caliber that it should be, of the situation that it should be. And that's very sad, because quite honestly, Canadians, well, my goddaughter, who I adore, I love her very much, she can draw a distinction. But the vast majority of Canadians will not be able to make that distinction between, say, Conservatives, Liberals, members of the Bloc, members of the NDP, members of the Green Party. We are just quite simply all politicians. And they saw that politicians were not responding to the level of the situation that they should have. So how then can you not ask a question and let the person have the time necessary to answer the question without howling in the chamber? Well, I'll close my parenthesis now. That is the second reason why I'm citing this. The third reason is a very serious one. We have people who share information with us. There is an oversight committee, of course, that is made up of parliamentarians to be seized with that information. But in each parliament in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, those people, well, they don't have public inquiries that deal with matters that are top secret in nature. They have very specialized committees to do so. And that really is the main reason why I say this is not the right place to go into matters in great depth, which I understand is the goal of people here around the table. Is this the right venue? Madam Chair, for those three reasons, I say we're just not in the right venue. We're not in the right place. But people are taking these leaks that are unconfirmed and are not corroborated by the responsible experts who appeared before us. So, by definition, if the information is legitimate, they represent only partial, incomplete information. And I can say that because they are incomplete, partial pieces of information, and the witnesses denied some of the pieces that were in the so-called leaks. But I remember the first day of our debate, my colleague from Edmonton St. Albert said, we can't, well, he seemed to say that we cannot doubt the journalists who are publishing this information. Well, in a way, I do agree, because the journalists are, I'm sure, acting in good faith. They are professionals. They have their sources of information. And though, Madam Chair, the problem is this. When I began to read the report on the events, Mr. Arar, that was published by Mr. Justice O'Connell, thank you, in that report that was published by an eminent personage, Dennis O'Connor, Mr. Justice Dennis O'Connor. What was his conclusion? The so-called leaks of information were not leaks of information. He was actually very hard on certain individuals, certain bad apples who were working for the RCMP or for the CSE. He was very clear and very hard on them, and also very hard on some journalists who did not take the time to verify, to authenticate. There were young journalists at the time, Bob Fife and other persons. Mr. Justice O'Connor was pretty hard on them. I think that it's very important to recall this because it was a major injustice, a travesty. that was perpetrated on Mr. Arar, who was an innocent man, as he said so. And Mr. Justice O'Connor concluded that that was indeed the case. Honestly. And not only was his physical life destroyed because he was tortured for a year, but there was complicity involved. I had the privilege of not just sitting here on this PROC committee, which is a major privilege, but also of sitting on the ethics committee. And tomorrow we will be speaking of foreign interference as well, but we will be looking at it from another aspect. We will be looking at the facts, the effect, rather, that this will have on the diaspora, on those communities here in Canada. And we always hear China, China, China. Well, I am not an admirer of everything the Beijing government does, the Beijing government does. You have to be very careful, though, because reputations are being destroyed with that information that those responsible for our institutions, whose goal is to ensure the safety of Canadians, well, some are saying this information is not true. But they have had the overall view, the perspective. They have heard our allies and what they say. They have seen information coming from employees, from Canadians who, in some cases, put their lives on the line to obtain that kind of intelligence. And they all came to the conclusion that what you read is not true. Madam Chair, really, sometimes you have to trust. You have to trust the experts. But if you want to play partisan games, one speaks of these elements as if they were good news. Excuse me, when I say good news, I mean sacred texts, just in case the interpreters did not understand my allusion or my choice of words. It's not really true. Those leaks, in the opinion of the experts. So I find it very frustrating each time that we discuss this. People say, oh, those allegations, they take them, the information, they take it for solid information that has been authenticated, that is true. But we were told that that is not the case. But the temptation is too great. You play political games. The temptation is too great to wind everything up, to wind up the news, to blow it all up, rather than to authenticate. Madam Chair, we have to trust what can be done, what we can do here in Prague. And we have to do that while respecting what the rights and privileges of others are. We don't want to hurt uselessly without justification the reputations of others. We have colleagues who are either born in China or came from China when they were very young, or who have parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents who are in China. It's no fun when you know that on the social media channels there are people that just go right off the deep end and write anything at all. And these people receive these or see these hateful messages, sometimes even threats. That doesn't just only affect the Chinese-Canadian community, but all Canadians whose ancestors came from Asia, because unfortunately, all of that is lumped together. There's an amalgam that is made by some Canadians to that effect, and certainly not by colleagues here. But when that is done, there are consequences. We have to be very careful. We have to use words judiciously. And, Madam Chair, we can't presume that everything that you read or hear in the media is okay, is true. When you ask questions of those who are directly responsible, they say that that information is not true. It's only partial, Madam Chair. And when you try to bring it together to have an overall global perspective, it doesn't supply the necessary grounding. It doesn't draw a picture when you look at certain little elements, certain pieces of it. I remember the first day that they said that I remember the news that first day reported in the newspapers that I think it was CSIS's representatives said to the Prime Minister that candidates should have their nomination withdrawn because they were under the influence of another country. Well, there were experts that said, that doesn't make any sense at all. No, it can't be. It doesn't happen like that. And then 2 days later, the leaks from the journalist changed the story, saying, okay, then that part wasn't true. Well, hey, 48 hours later, everybody was believing the worst about some individuals, but it wasn't true. First of all, it wasn't true. That resembles rather so much what Mr. Justice O'Connor said, represented true injustice. Madam Chair, we have to be very, very, very careful indeed, before we reach these hasty conclusions. And that's the reason why we have intelligence services that take that information. I remember Mr. David Vignon, who was in charge of CSIS. I guess I should say it in French, the SARS. He told us, he said, reports aren't intelligence. They have to put that into the bigger context. And very often, they receive information that you have to wait on. You have to be patient about before you develop any conclusions, because you don't give the Prime Minister information that is incomplete, that is only partial information. And insofar as possible, you give him information that is justifiable. With their long experience, they are able to do that. So, Madam Chair, it's extremely important to remember the wrong that was done in the past. And I know it's voluminous. Mr. Justice O'Connor's report is a big one. But it will give you, I think, offer you a sense of embarrassment. No, I don't mean that. I think that you will gain wisdom, and it will help you. It will help you to ask good questions, to look at what is before you, to see that it is complete so you can reach good conclusions. I believe that it is very important. My mother always told me, you have 2 ears and a mouth, so you better listen. So we can do the same with the information that we have. Can we have a bigger, more complete picture? And if we're not able to have that information, we have to trust those who are entrusted with doing that work. I think that we had all the very best sources before us. They were there to be asked questions, and I found they answered with a great deal of candor, without revealing details or any secrets, but they gave us a better understanding, a better, bigger picture, how they reached their conclusions. And they came to the conclusion that what we read in the newspapers, those leaks of information, are very incomplete. All that's incomplete. And the conclusion that was reached by some are not, the conclusions are not just, even erroneous, I would say. I think that this is one of the reasons why, Madam Chair, I do not want this committee to get on the wrong path here. I'm very proud of what we've done here on the issues of national security and intelligence. We've been able to develop new tools, like I said, to put at the disposal of the government to fight foreign interference. Those tools are important, but are they complete? Maybe not. They're still being assessed to see whether or not there might be something new, a new tool that could be developed that could be used to protect Canadians. And I think it's very important. Madam Chair, I am concluding, but I would just like to say that it is 5:23 in the afternoon. It's been 4 hours now since my colleague made those unfortunate remarks to the Minister of Global Affairs. And he did not take up my offer. I said that he could use a point of order to interrupt me at any time to apologize. So it's been 4 hours now, some. Madam Chair, I will be stopping here for the time being. And I hope that my colleagues will, at the very least, recognize that there are all these tools that we have. They are important tools. They are the appropriate tools to deal with and have access to all the information. They are more appropriate. They are the ones that should be dealing with these matters of information. And I'm quite sure that when they look into the issue of foreign interference that we have before us, they will reach the same conclusions as our experts did. The men and the women who are responsible for protecting all of us. And so, Madam Chair, I will stop here, and I hope that people have heard some wisdom in my words. And I also hope that my colleague will take this opportunity, this pause, to burnish his image and to apologize. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Turnbull.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and sorry that I had to be away from the committee for a few minutes there, but I'm glad to be back and glad to still get my turn to speak to the amendment that I put forward. Again, I think it's quite reasonable to ask the campaign directors to come before the committee as additional witnesses. I think we've had a whole host of credible witnesses, and I think, you know, in terms of our study, for me, I mean, we've heard from the majority of witnesses, some of them more than once, and they've given us some very compelling testimony. I don't think it gives the Conservatives what they're looking for, and I think that's why they continue to push us to, have to debate this topic. But, to me, I really think this is clear-cut. Our government has been acting on foreign election interference for since 2015. We know that the past government, prior to that, did absolutely nothing on foreign election interference, and that's a fact. I've never heard a Conservative say otherwise. In fact, in the House, though, we heard an exchange between Minister LeBlanc and the leader of the official opposition, when Minister LeBlanc said, when my friend, the opposition leader, was the minister responsible for democratic institutions, he did nothing when intelligence agencies raised the issue over 10 years ago. And Mr. Poilievre's response was, Mr. Speaker, and this is a quote, "We did not have to because the communist dictatorship in Beijing was not helping the Conservative Party to get elected." I don't know how anyone can hear remarks like that and not fully understand that the Conservative motivations here are clearly partisan. When we heard Minister LeBlanc come before the committee today, he made reference to this statement, calling it a perverse sense of how a minister would take their responsibilities. So for the leader of the official opposition, who formerly was responsible for democratic institutions, to say such a thing, I think it really speaks to the fact of the true motivations for what the Conservatives are trying to do, and they're well known for this as a party because they've done this over and over and over again. And anyway, so we've seen this. It's not that surprising. I think many Canadians know that this is sort of the new Conservative Party of Canada that is constantly becoming more extreme and trying to stoke more division and trying to question our democratic institutions, and won't let any of the facts get in the way of their partisan games. We also know that Mr. Poilievre said this week in English, and this is a direct quote, contrary to what Mr. Cooper said in our previous meeting today. Pierre Poilievre said, they're so concerned how Canada is working against its own interests and for a foreign dictator's interest, end quote. And then said in French, and I quote the English, "We've never seen an intelligence service so worried about a prime minister and his collaboration with a foreign power," end quote. So for me, this is just morally reprehensible. It's disgusting. It reeks of partisanship. It is, I think, really calling into question the motivations of our prime minister, who, like all of us, stood for office and is doing this for the benefit of the country and giving so much to this country. And I think it's just utterly disgusting. I don't even have words to describe how I feel about it. It actually makes me sad to think that this is the kind of politics we have in this country today. So I would really hope that when you also add in the comments that Mr. Cooper made earlier to the Minister Joly, which I found very offensive. And I really wish Mr. Cooper would realize just how gender-biased his remarks were and how disempowering that would feel. I can't put myself in the minister's shoes, but I can say we totally expect tough questions, of course, to ministers when they come before this committee, and holding the government to account is all of our responsibilities. It's something we all take very seriously, but when you are a complete, total jerk about it and, are offensive and are, basically putting on display for everybody that you're gender biased and discriminatory in your perspectives, you're just embarrassing yourself. It would be nice for him to actually man up and apologize for those comments. Anyway, I'm sure we'll keep waiting for that to happen, and I'm hopeful that he will find, in his better judgment, at some point in the near future, a way to come back to us and hopefully apologize for those remarks. Look, I've spent a lot of time talking about just how much our government has done on foreign election interference, and I've been very careful to also say that we should never think that, or allow ourselves to think that we've done enough. Like, we need to evolve and do more, along with the threats that our adversaries, and we've heard this from multiple witnesses. I think every member of the government that's come before this committee, whether they be public servants or ministers or deputy ministers, everybody has said the same thing, is that Canada needs to take these threats seriously. It is doing that, but it also needs to constantly reflect and consider how we can strengthen the many different strategies that we have currently. So, but I think it's important to give kind of an overview, a summary, a more condensed summary, because I think, again, it speaks to the fact that our government, and I think for me it would be really nice to hear some acknowledgement of that. It would really go a long way in our debates and conversations on a study that's so important. If parties, and I don't have a lot of hope, obviously, for the Conservative Party, because, I've just given you quotes about how hyper-partisan they're being about an issue, and then on the one hand claiming they want to get to the truth, then when they hear from the security experts and intelligence experts that are the most prominent figures in their fields that are coming and telling us the things that we should be doing, they're not willing to listen to that. They're not taking it into consideration, and then even what they're being told and what the reports are saying, they're ignoring the facts. And, so to me, I think my job is to continue to confront their partisanship with facts and information, which we have plenty of. And so, and I don't think that's being unreasonable. I think that just extends our debate, of course. And I think for us, we need an acknowledgement that our government has been doing a lot on foreign election interference, that just because the Conservative Party woke up to this recently doesn't mean that our government has been inactive. So, right back to 2017, we passed the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians Act, and then formed NSICOP with members from all parties. We all know this. So we all have members of our parties that sit on that committee of parliamentarians. So how can anyone say, so that's just one thing. I realize if that was all we had done, okay, fine, you could perhaps criticize. But, and I'm not saying that we can't be critical. We should be critical. That's fine. But when you're ignoring the facts, that's not informed based on the information that we've been given. So I think to respect the process, we really need to review those facts until, in my view, people acknowledge that those things are all real, positive, sizable steps forward in protecting our democracy. And so in 2018, I mentioned that the Ethics Committee report on threats to democracy and the substantive government response to that, which came shortly after. We established the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity with a budget of $155 million. And we announced the rapid response mechanism at the 2018 G7 summit. So that's in 2018. So, those are three sizable, those are not small things. The Ethics Committee wrote more than 100-page report, and the government responded. And then the government did some things that relate to foreign election interference. One of them being setting up the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, giving it a budget to do its job, and setting up the rapid response mechanism with other G7 partners. So I think, those things have to be acknowledged. They're significant. And then in 2019, there were many more steps taken. So, you think, okay, there was a major report that a committee did in 2018, and then some things were immediately done that year. And then in 2019, there were a whole host of other things done. And this is where I would say, so before the 2019 election, there was 6 or 7 major steps taken. So one was the announcement of the plan to protect Canadian democracy. I mentioned this before, but I'm just referring back to it to say that 4-pillar plan really represents an all-of-government approach. And, if you look at the details of that plan, you can see that there are, and we could actually check off the things that have been done as a result of that plan. I mean, we're not just, conservatives always seem to say, oh, well, liberals just talk about things and they don't do anything. Well, no, these things got done. They got done. They did get done. So you can't deny that. I can give you very specific examples, and I'd be happy to do that if, Mrs. Block, I see you shaking your head. But to me, these things got done. And I'm not saying that they're perfect, but I'm saying none of these things were in place before our government came to power. So I'm not, this isn't rose-colored glasses moment for me. These are real, tangible steps that have been taken. We set up the site task force, which includes CSIS, RCMP, the Rapid Response Mechanism, and the Communication Security Establishment. We passed Bill C-76, the Elections Modernization Act, which strengthened or added protections for third parties to funnel funds into partisan advertising, in addition to a bunch of other things. Now, it's important to keep in mind, of course, C-76 was tabled in the House in 2018, and it took till almost the end of 2019, I believe, to actually get passed through the House. So that Elections Modernization Act added a whole bunch of things that I think are really, significant. And I went through some of those in my previous comments. But, just to summarize, there was a whole bunch of things added to strengthen our process. We also passed Bill C-59, which was tabled in the House in 2017. So and that's an act respecting national security matters. That act gave CSIS and CSE, which is the Communication Security Establishment, new threat reduction measures. So again, when we had CSIS come before us, the director said they do intervene and use threat reduction measures. Obviously, those powers were given to them through an act that our government tabled in the House of Commons, and that took 2 years to get through the House, came into force in 2019. But it shows a significant progress over between 2017 and 2019. There were multiple legislative things that took place. There were numerous bodies that were set up, including the Site Task Force. And again, the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol and the panel were also established before the election. We also have examples like the Canada Declaration on Election Integrity online, which was a commitment that all of the major social media platforms and online platforms committed to. That's, again, another sizable undertaking. It's not like we just threw that up and people just agreed to it. There's a lot of work that went into that. So, again, for the opposition parties to keep claiming that we've done nothing is just ignorant of the facts. The other thing that I was really happy to read about earlier this morning, which was I just happened to dive deeper into this, was the Digital Citizen Initiative through Canadian Heritage. Again, I'd like to take the time tonight to demonstrate to you this all-of-government approach, which involves multiple departments all working together on foreign election interference, both prevention, primary prevention, right, and early intervention, which involves educating the public, right? It involves people being more aware. So things like a digital citizen initiative, which really is, trying to educate people on digital literacy, that was composed of 23 projects over 9 months and reached 12 million Canadians. So that's 12 million Canadians that learned about digital literacy, in other words, how to question the content that they consume online, which we know is the the biggest way that people consume information today. So those 23 projects over 9 months reached 12 million Canadians. That's a significant undertaking. It didn't just happen overnight. There was lots of work that went into that. Canadian Heritage led that work, and it had an impact. Now, we could ask ourselves, well, how much impact did it have? And we could say, okay, what else do we need to do on that front? And I would suggest that we need to do more. But what's interesting is if I look at Budget 2022, there's more resources for initiatives like that as well. So again, I'm being critical of my own government and reflecting and saying, okay, what haven't we done yet? But when you're not operating in the realm of reality or fact, then how are you making a judgment? To me, I'm looking at the information that we've been given and informing myself based on that, which is something it seems, at least the Conservative members don't seem willing to do. And I think that, again, reeks of partisanship because it's just a willful ignorance of the facts. And, I think we have to look at the information we've been given and the testimony of the security experts and intelligence experts that we've heard from. Another initiative was the Get Cyber Safe program, which is a national public awareness campaign created to inform Canadians about cybersecurity. So not only did we do digital literacy training, we also did a major public awareness campaign. And that was led by the Communications Security Establishment. And it's an important part of an overall strategy, again, which links it to another major strategy of the government called the National Cybersecurity Strategy. So again, this, I feel demonstrates very clearly how there's kind of a whole of government approach. I've described so far how we've launched a 4-pillar plan called the Plan to Protect Canadian Democracy. We set up the Site Task Force, which includes CSIS, RCMP, the Rapid Response Mechanism, CSE. We passed 2 bills. We set up the Public Protocol and Panel for within the writ period or within the election period. And we did the declaration on election integrity online, the Digital Citizen Initiative, and the Get Cyber Safe. That was all in 2019, before the election. So, again, for anyone to claim that we didn't do anything or that we weren't taking foreign interference into account or taking it seriously is just, again, ignorant of the facts. In 2020, there was an independent assessment done. We all know that that was done. So an independent person was appointed named James Judd and produced a report. I have it here. There's some really good analysis and suggestions, most of which were followed through on, if not all were followed through on. The vast majority of them seem to have been implemented. And obviously the government has to assess what the best way forward is. But I think the report, there's evidence that the report was taken seriously, that the independent advice of Mr. Judd was taken into consideration, and that there were measures and mechanisms and initiatives that were implemented based on those recommendations. Again, shows responsible leadership, a government that took the independent advice into consideration. It demonstrates how the government, again, is taking this threat seriously. So I just don't understand how anyone can claim, maybe we could find consensus in some way if the Conservative Party of Canada would just live in reality, would just actually come to terms with some of the facts about the things that our government has done. Maybe a member of that party could, maybe pipe in today on a point of order and say, hey, we recognize the government has done a lot on foreign election interference, and we all now want to reflect on how we move forward and what else we can do. And then we could have a constructive, nonpartisan, committed conversation, because we do all really, I really believe when it comes down to it, we all really do care about our democracy. We want the health, we want to protect the health of our democracy. I know I do. I really care about our democracy. So for anyone to claim that our party, our leader, myself, or anybody else doesn't take this seriously, it's just deeply offensive. It's deeply offensive. And I won't stand for it because it's not true. So cut it out and let's work together. Let's work together on the things that we know we need to do. And I mean, I think we have 16 recommendations from the newest report, the newest independent report from Morris Rosenberg. And Morris Rosenberg wrote a really substantive report. I would say it's even better than the first report after 2019, the Judd report. I feel like the Rosenberg report has even more substance in it, more things that we can do or consider doing to, and I know the Prime Minister has already made an announcement about asking Minister LeBlanc and the Privy Council to, within 30 days, look at all of the reports that have been done and say, okay, we're going to implement these and come up with an implementation plan. So I think, to me, that's, again, shows a responsiveness. It shows that there was an independent assessment done. It shows that we care and that we're considering that independent advice. I don't know how parties like the Bloc Québécois can criticize, because they didn't even show up for the briefings during the last election. In the Rosenberg, I mentioned this earlier because I'm dumbfounded by this little fact in a footnote, which to me is, I came across this and I thought, okay, first of all, it's difficult to understand how the Conservatives, the NDP, and others can claim that they didn't know about things and sort of almost claim ignorance when they were part of these briefings. But then on the other hand, the Bloc never came to the briefings. So, I don't know how it just seems very rich for them to then be all accusatory of the government in not being transparent enough. Well, you didn't even come to the briefings to get briefings on foreign election interference in the 2021 election. It is clearly said in the report that Rosenberg wrote. So, again, I feel frustrated by the fact that our opposition parties don't really want to work on this issue, in my view, but just seem to want to push some political agenda that they have. So I hope that we can get through that logjam and come to terms with the fact that there are facts in the matter and that we should be taking those into consideration. Again, I would just say in 2021, so I mentioned in 2020, again, I'm establishing a timeline and a pattern of responsible leadership. I know that's hard. Nobody wants to listen to that, it seems, but that's the truth. So responsible leadership is there's all of these different initiatives to tackle foreign election interference. And as the threats to Canadian democracy are evolving, our government is responding each step along the way. You can see it year over year over year. That's not to say it's perfect. I'm not claiming that. And I think we have to seriously look at it. But that's exactly what we've been doing. Every step, every year, there's a track record of progress. So if you're denying that there's been progress, then I don't know how we come to terms with moving forward on a study when you just won't look at the information and facts that we've been given. And that's our job as a committee. Our job is to come to these studies and to do this work in good faith for the benefit of Canadians. And we're not benefiting Canadians when we deny the facts and the information that we've been given. That's just, to me, we're just avoiding our responsibilities in a sense. We're just not really taking this work seriously if we're not willing to look at the facts. and it's unfortunate, but that's what we're seeing today. So in 2021, our government worked on updating that Canada Declaration on Election Integrity online, and that got updated and done again in terms of the commitment for the online platforms. Again, I wouldn't say, I think Rosenberg quite rightly says, well, yes, but that's great to have that declaration, but social media companies still, and I could quote the quote if you would like, but I remember off the top of my head, and I'll be paraphrasing, so my apologies to the folks in the committee if they remember verbatim what Rosenberg wrote, but he basically said, well, online platforms, even though they've signed this declaration, still are the major source of mis and disinformation, and that's where Canadians are consuming a lot of that information. So could we criticize and say, well, maybe the declaration doesn't go far enough? Maybe we need to do deeper work with online platforms around, foreign election interference and disinformation and the dissemination of that on their platforms. And I mean, we've talked a lot in different committees about this issue, about disinformation being so widespread and just how much of an impact that has on Canadians. And we can see that, yes, there were instances of disinformation in the last election, and both foreign and domestic. Quite a lot of it, I'm sure, if we were to have our experts in this area come before us, they would showcase many examples of online campaigns that featured information that was not quite accurate or put a spin on things that could potentially influence voter behavior and voter intentions. Now, I think it's very difficult for us to establish a direct link, and I think we've heard that, and that's one of the challenges that we all have to come to terms with, is that we don't know just how much disinformation out there is impacting Canadians' perhaps sense of disenfranchisement, perhaps their level of anger and frustration with Canadian democracy, perhaps their feelings towards different parties and their policies. We don't know the direct causal links because people consume so much information and get so many different impressions that they then base their decisions on. So, and a lot of that is not even conscious for many Canadians. You see something, you react to it, you relate to it in a certain way, you associate it with something else, you internalize it. Some people are able to block it out, other people are not. How does that resonate with you over time? Everybody is slightly different. Ms. Block may not react to things the same way that Ms. Gray does or Mr. Barrett does or anybody else on this side. We're all quite different in terms of how we internalize the information that we're consuming, whether it's online or not. So I think that the point I'm trying to make here is that perhaps a declaration on election integrity online, even though it's been a positive step, and that it's been updated, and that social media platforms at least have expressed a commitment to protecting our elections, perhaps we can go a lot further and a lot deeper on that work. And I'd be happy to get into a debate on, like a constructive debate on how we move forward in relation to ensuring that foreign election interference, is tackling the challenges that naturally come with online platforms having so much power in our democracy today. And this goes right back to the 2018 report, which was by the Ethics Committee, and I note that Mr. Fergus served for quite some time on the Ethics Committee, and I know it's done great work. And I noticed that you participated in some way in that report, even though I don't think at the time you were on the Ethics Committee. But that report, I've looked at it. I haven't had the time to read all 100 and whatever pages, but I look forward to reading it because I did read the government response, and the government response is very substantive. And the recommendations coming out of that report really dig into online disinformation. Even the title of the report is all about, looking at just how our whole democracy is shifting based on online platforms disseminating so much information that people consume, and just having more power over the Canadian public in terms of where people are getting their information. So to me, it highlights the importance of this area. We could be digging into that, and I would invite that. I think out of this study, we could have some very serious conversations about how to move forward. And I would be really happy to deliberate on that with my opposition colleagues and to really talk that through with the very substantive reports that we have, that we can use as background information to make some determinations as to what we can do. Now, in 2022, budget 2022 in particular, our government made additional commitments to, in the budget, again, showcasing a track record here of progress. Our government after 2021 didn't just, go rest on our laurels and say, okay, no, we can't do more or become passive in this regard in any way. We made additional commitments and rolled out new supports and measures to tackle foreign election interference. And I've mentioned some of these before, but I'll just quickly condense them into a very short summary here, which is expanding the. Thank you, Greg. Thank you. We committed to expanding the rapid response mechanism and offering more resources to that. And when you think about G7 countries all tackling the very same issues in terms of threats to their democracy, I really do think that they're going through the same things. So the more we share information and collaborate, and the more we strengthen our kind of early warning systems for foreign election interference by working with our G7 partners, the better. I'm sure that everyone here agrees with that that's a positive step, that first of all, our government setting up the rapid response mechanism in 2018 was a good thing. I'm sure everyone agrees that collaborating with G7 partners on identifying foreign actors in their strategies to intervene, or interrupt our elections in any way is a good thing. And then I'm sure everyone agrees that adding more resources and expanding that initiative is also positive. I'm sure everyone would agree that. I also would note that we enhanced cybersecurity activities to protect against disinformation. So that's also, I think, a positive step to moving forward. We funded more research to support public institutions to continue to look at foreign election interference and to understand how they can protect themselves. We also added resources to the Privy Council office to coordinate, develop, and implement government-wide measures. And I think that, to me, is really positive. Again, the Privy Council plays a key role in all of this. We heard that today from Minister LeBlanc, and we've noted it before in terms of the public protocol, and just how important the Privy Council office is in coordinating and developing and implementing government-wide measures. I also mentioned the 2023 independent assessment. Again, the Rosenberg report has 16 recommendations. So I'm sure all the members of this committee have read those recommendations. I'm sure all members have read those recommendations and are, considering them. But when I asked Minister LeBlanc today when he was here, he was very clear about saying, yes, we will be implementing what is recommended in the Rosenberg report. Obviously, there's a process there to look at what's been recommended. Perhaps the government will say, well, on one or two, we may take a slightly different path. But the point is that many of, and this is the same with the Judd report, many of the recommendations were implemented. So again, it shows very clearly laid out a track record of concern for Canadian democracy, for progress, for taking tangible, important steps forward, and ensuring that we're protecting and doing our utmost to protect Canadian democracy. So I think, and then lastly, for this timeline overview that I'm giving, we have the Prime Minister's announcement, which we've all heard about by now, and I'm sure many of the members took note of the, I think, more important and sizable next steps that the Prime Minister outlined. But one, he had a conversation with NSICOP's chair, our good colleague David McGuinty, who I think is just a fantastic chair and really, a really great parliamentarian that I've benefited from many conversations with him since I got here in 2019. And I really think he's doing a great job. I know he takes his role on that committee very seriously. And I think I trust that he's doing his utmost to implement and recommend strategies and measures that will help protect Canadian democracy from foreign interference. I note that the Prime Minister, in his remarks, asked the chair of NSICOP and the head of NSIRA to start work on foreign election interference. And I think that's a really good thing. I think that work is already starting to commence very soon, as far as I know. We also note that there's an appointment that will come soon. In the coming weeks, I think it was pretty clear in the remarks that the Prime Minister made to appoint an independent special rapporteur to assess the situation and make recommendations on protecting and enhancing Canadians' faith in our democracy. And that special rapporteur will independently look at what we need to do, assess all of the allegations that have been made and the, information that's out there that Canadians are concerned about right now, and we'll identify gaps in our systems and our mechanisms that have been set up by our government. And I trust that will be a nonpartisan, impartial process that will, again, give us that outside perspective that's not colored by any partisan politics, and will offer really good, thoughtful, fact-based suggestions on how to move forward. And, whether a public inquiry is a recommendation or not, we'll have to see. I kind of think, again, based on the testimony that we heard, there's lots of people that don't agree that a public inquiry is the best way forward. And I take them very seriously. I know my colleague, Mr. Gerritsen, when he was here earlier today, spoke to the fact that the previous campaign director for the Conservative Party in the last election, Delory, said that he didn't think that a public inquiry was the best way forward. And I have his remarks here that I've, he says a public inquiry is not the best way to address the issue of election interference. No meaningful solutions will come from it. That's a direct quote. I don't know. I feel like I should read that again. I'm not sure anyone's listening. Quote, a public inquiry is not the best way to address the issue of election interference, period. No meaningful solutions will come from it. And then he says, a multi-partisan committee working with security officials is a better way to identify and address the problems and find lasting solutions to protect our elections for the future, end quote. This is for me, this corroborates what we heard from security and intelligence professionals like Jody Thomas, who, and David Morrison, who pointed to the fact that, these highly sensitive documents and information that would be required to review both need expertise to be interpreted because they come with so many caveats and are only part of a picture and sometimes misleading. You know, that we require sort of trained professionals, but also there's some significant risks to Canada's national security and the individuals that make up that community. Let's not forget that the national security community is made up of real people that are doing work on behalf of Canadians as well. And we can't just hang them out to dry because the Conservatives think we should be, you know, exposing all of the, you know, things that you know, all of the intelligence that the national security community has. So I think if Fred Delory agrees with security and intelligence professionals, perhaps the Conservatives could consider that even one of their own, you know, not just anybody, their previous national campaign manager is agreeing that, you know, with the national security and intelligence professionals, all of whom seem to be saying the same thing, which is that you're not going to get what you want out of a public inquiry. And we all agree, and I think everyone agrees, that we need to, like, this issue is important to the public. They need to be aware that it's an issue. They need to be aware of what the government is doing. They need to be more aware on an everyday basis to know what to watch out for. And that's why I think that, you know, initiative around raising awareness, the public campaign that I talked about awareness online when Canadians are reading and consuming information. Like, how many of us are consuming information online every day? My daughter did something just the other week, and she said, "Daddy, you spend a lot of time on social media." And I said, "Well, no, I don't. I don't really," you know, I was kind of in denial about it. So she went, I mean, she's a smart kid. She's 11 years old. She pulled out my phone and she went into the screen time portion of it. I had spent 11 hours of screen time in one day on my phone. I wasn't all on social media. But can you imagine? And then I'm, you know, and so how much information are we consuming online on a daily basis? I mean, I've seen evidence to suggest that Canadians on average are spending over an hour on social media alone. So, you know, it really is an important topic to consider, just how, you know, online information consumption is impacting the public, and how important it is to make people aware of what they're looking at, and to improve digital literacy and raise awareness around what does foreign election interference look like for the Canadian public when it's done online, which I think is what the Rosenberg report shows, is that the main examples of things that qualified as attempts at interference coming from foreign state actors were disinformation campaigns, so online. So I think it highlights the importance of how this is shifting Canada's democracy and shifting that overall threat environment that we need to take seriously. So I think, and we are. I mean, we are. There's nobody that can doubt that we are. I mean, you can if you want to ignore all the facts, but I would suggest that if you just do some reading and look at reality, live in reality, then you would be able to, I think, have a good, fulsome debate and discussion based on the information that we have at our fingertips. And anyway, you know, the Prime Minister's remarks also included a number of other tangible next steps. So one was the Minister of Public Safety will launch the consultation on a new foreign influence transparency registry in Canada. This is something that every party has said might be a really good thing to do. I think Australia and some other countries have done it. I think the United States as well, if I'm not mistaken. And you know, so if our government is starting to move forward on a consultation process, I think this is another substantive step that shows that we're taking this seriously and that we really want to keep up with the threats to our democracy and ensure that we're protecting Canadians and our democratic institutions as best we can. Also, the Minister of Public Safety was tasked with immediately establishing a national counter foreign interference coordinator position. And I mean, this is another important step. I already mentioned the importance of the Privy Council office and in terms of coordination across government, but having a foreign interference coordinator in public safety is also an extremely positive next step, because we know that, again, every government institution, every ministry, every part of government needs to be protected from foreign interference. It's not just our elections. What we've heard from the Rosenberg report was that Maurice Rosenberg says, well, a lot of the public protocol focuses on the writ period, and that we should be extending our focus outside of the writ period. So pre-writ, which in a minority parliament, what is pre-writ? I wonder, I mean, it's all the time, right? It's the whole time. It's an election looms at every moment. So I think for me, you know, taking that report and that independent assessment that Rosenberg has done seriously, I think the Prime Minister has quite rightly announced or tasked the Public Safety Minister with establishing a coordinator position on foreign interference as another positive next step forward. And lastly, in terms of this timeline, I think the other really big tangible step forward that the Prime Minister made was to task Minister LeBlanc and the Clerk of the Privy Council to review all of the reports that have been done on this topic. So NSICOP is one, Rosenberg report is another, but any other reports that have been done, I think should be reviewed. And I think that the way that it was phrased in the Prime Minister's remarks was to really do a comprehensive review of recommendations and to come up within 30 days an implementation plan. I mean, I think that's responsible. I think it's a very compressed timeline for the amount of recommendations that are in those reports. But I do think that that it starts to move from, you know, basic recommendations to how are we actually going to implement these things. So, and I think that's important. I did strategic planning for a living for quite a number of years, and that's how I would approach it. I would identify recommendations and a strategic plan, and then quickly develop implementation plans, and then divide those up into implementation plans or action plans for each of the ministries, and then have ministers who are accountable for those to take them on with timelines attached to them. To me, that's how you get things done, right? You don't just wave a wand and say, oh, we're going to make this happen. You actually have to, you know, do a comprehensive review of all of the recommendations that are in those reports, pull them all together, decide and deliberate on which ones make sense and which ones may not, because I think there's always an opportunity So, and there's always an opportunity to, you know, sort of decide on what the best way forward is. And I mean, that's where we should be, you know, I think that would be a good role for our committee to play that would be really constructive, would be to look at all of the reports and recommendations ourselves, and then be recommending things, you know, out of our study and our work that Minister LeBlanc and the Clerk of the Privy Council could consider. I mean, to me, that would be a great contribution to the next steps that Minister LeBlanc would be, has been tasked with developing in the next 30 days. So to me, that would be a really positive next step. So I think for me, I would just maybe wrap up here by saying that, you know, I've established a timeline of progress, tangible steps that have been taken on foreign election interference. It's clearly laid out in the Rosenberg report, so no one can say they don't have this information. All of us have the information that I've gathered. I've taken the time to do that. I would invite other members to actually look at the facts, the timelines, and the information. And perhaps if members would like, I'd be happy to send them an overview of what I've worked on here, just to make sure that they, feel that they have the information at their fingertips, and that we can make sure that in the future we all start our conversation from the point of view of facts and evidence and living in reality and looking at the information and the progress that's been made, which has been substantive. And I don't think there's any questioning that. Okay, that's it for me, Madam Chair. Really appreciate the time and the attention of my colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. So the resources we had asked for this committee were from 4:30 to 6:30, and we are approaching 6:30. What I would like to share with all members is that we have been able to secure resources for Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. to resume this meeting. So you should have an email in your inbox that confirms that we will resume this meeting on Tuesday, 10:30 a.m. in this room. With that, I am going to suspend the meeting, and I will see you on Tuesday. See you next Tuesday, everyone. Thank you.